Hi there and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about the housing crisis in Portugal. Over the last weekend in 22 Portuguese cities there were large-scale protests organised by the Casa para Viver movement and various other organisations which were basically protesting against the absence of affordable accommodation in the country. And today we're going to delve into some of the reasons behind that and maybe look at some of the fallacies involved. First of all, I just want to indicate that I do have some degree of sympathy with many of the people in Portugal who make the case that housing just is not affordable here. Portugal is not a rich country, and according to 2022 statistics anyway, around about half the working population were earning less than €1,000 per month. So on that kind of salary, it's a little bit difficult. One can easily imagine why it would be difficult to be able to afford rental prices, at least in some of the major metropolitan areas, and even in some smaller cities like Coimbra. I could imagine that it would be very, very difficult. And that's about rent. I mean, buying is another matter because house prices have obviously been increasing over the last decade in Portugal, basically. And many people have the idea that they've been pushed out of the market, that it's no longer affordable for them. It's definitely true that housing prices in Portugal have been trending upward, although 2023 witnessed quite a suppressed transaction volume in the housing sales market anyway. 2024 has witnessed somewhat of a rebound, and we're seeing house prices across the nation in the year to April 2024 up by an average of about 7%. And in different areas, obviously the price increase is even more than that. For example, I think Madeira stands out with nearly a 20% year-on-year increase. In terms of the causes of this situation, I think speculation definitely has a role to play, and the protesters are right to highlight that. You know, if people are buying several homes with the intention of them selling them on at higher prices, then I think that that does contribute to rising prices. It takes properties off the rental market. Yeah, definitely it will create more pressure in the space, and it will lead to people having to pay up in order to get into accommodation. Fundamentally, though, I think speculation is something which is practiced by wealthier Portuguese, perhaps people who have returned from abroad, people who derive their income from abroad, or just people who've been involved in the property game for a while, flipping houses, so on and so forth. And definitely they play a role in driving prices up. I think that as well, this is basically confined to areas that are either major urban centres or tourist destinations. There's not a lot of speculation going on in other areas of the country. Of course, there is some, but it's a factor more in those big cities. The present government has, of course, been accused of not doing enough to rein in speculation and even being in league with real estate companies and speculators. I don't want to comment on that, but certainly it seems that the measures that they've taken thus far haven't really been very effective, and that they don't seem to be taking this issue as seriously as they should. Another cause is the lack of new construction. Portugal does not build enough new houses. And even in Portugal, when you look at the statistics and you see like, oh, this number of new houses were built, in cities like Lisbon and Porto, it's actually not a new house in many cases. It's simply a renovation, maybe a major renovation of an older building, and it's classified as a new build. So it's not really reflective of new accommodation coming onto the market. It's just something which has been off the market for some time while it was renovated and decorated. So I think that needs to be considered. But talking about pure new construction, as someone who has tried to build a house in Portugal, it is not an easy process. It can take years, and sometimes it can take years just to get the necessary approvals. There's a lot of red tape involved, a lot of expenses involved, and it's enough to deter most people from getting involved in it, to be honest. I have neighbours who are going through that process of building a house now, and it's fair to say they've met quite a number of obstacles, and they're not too happy with the process. Against this backdrop of immense red tape and bureaucracy, it's hardly surprising that not very many houses get built here, and as a consequence there's not very much new supply entering the market. Statistics from the Financial Times, as you can see in the graph, demonstrate that Portugal is actually the lowest of the countries featured in terms of new housing per thousand of population, which definitely, I think, paints a picture, and it's one of the major sources of this problem. It's why we don't have enough houses, is because frankly not enough are being built, perhaps because it's so difficult to build them. However, I do think that we should be a little bit wary about saying, there are not enough new houses being built, therefore it leads to this housing crisis, because Portugal has a housing stock of over 6 million, and it has the second highest housing vacancy rate in Europe. So it has an astonishing number of something like 720,000 vacant homes, including over 47,000 vacant homes in the Lisbon metropolitan area. So it's not a country with a shortage of homes. It's a country with a shortage of available homes for occupation. Now, why is this? I mean, there are a variety of reasons. Some of these houses could be second homes. Some of them could be homes which are just on the market for a long, long time, because in Portugal, houses do tend to sit on the market for a while. It can be a year or more. One of our neighbours just sold his house after more than a year on the market. So, I mean, that could definitely be a factor. Another one could be that many of these houses are in rural areas, and they're basically inheritances from parents or relatives who have maybe passed away or gone into care. The children are either out of Portugal, or maybe they live in a big city somewhere else, and the house is just there. It might actually be an inheritance where there are several brothers and sisters involved, and those are always complicated in Portugal. So the result of that is that the property just tends to sit there and nothing happens to it. It's not used for anything, maybe because the siblings can't agree on whether to sell it or what to use it for. It's a common phenomenon both with land and houses, especially in rural areas of Portugal. Another factor which comes in for blame when people are talking about why this housing crisis exists in Portugal, and this is a crisis which exists in other countries as well. For example, the UK has a housing crisis. So Portugal is not unique in this, but the situation may be a little bit more severe here. I'm prepared to grant that. I saw an article which I'll show on the screen here, which suggested heavily that the major cause of house price appreciation and the problems with rising rents were the fact that there were so many NHR, this non-habitual residence tax scheme, foreigners in the country. So basically wealthy foreigners have been coming into Portugal and pushing up the prices, and it's putting Portuguese people in an invidious position. They're being pushed out of the market because it's just too expensive for them and they can't bear it. Now, amongst all of the reasons why housing prices are going up, I think that this NHR thing is probably the most minor one. But it's one which is honed in on in this article, and also was mentioned by the protesters at the weekend. They're saying, all these NHR foreigners are coming in here. Before it was the golden visa people, but that's been stopped now, so they can't say that anymore. But now it's these rich NHR foreigners. They're causing this problem. Let's stop that. Don't give these people tax advantages. I think this neglects the fact that the NHR program has basically been hollowed out by new legislation, and it's no longer as attractive as it used to be or as accessible as it was now. So I think that problem has been solved. And I also think that you have to consider the NHR program has been going since around 2009, and many of the people who've been in the program from an early date are now starting to drop out of it. I mean, it's not a permanent thing. It only lasts for 10 years, and therefore it will gradually disappear. There are now fewer and fewer applicants, and there will be people who will start to fall out of the system. When you had a lot of applicants, for example, in 2015 and 2016, in 2025 and 2026, those people are going to fall out of the system. And if they remain in Portugal, then they're just going to be normal tax residents. Anyway, the foundation of this point is simply that there are a lot, in the opinion of the author of the article, of NHR applicants. There were over 16,300 new applications in 2023, and it has been on an uptrend. This is before the system was nixed, obviously. So 16,300 in 2023. And the author suggests that that represents, a massive amount when you compare that to the number of sales transactions and rental transactions in Portugal, and therefore is influencing the market, pushing up prices significantly. Basically, what the author here is saying is that in 2023 there were around 168,000 housing transactions for property purchases, and a further 92,000 rental contracts were signed. And if you take the number of around 16,300 NHR applicants in that year, and you divide that by the number of property sales transactions, you come at a figure of about 9.8%, let's just call it 10%. And therefore the argument is made that this is having a phenomenal impact, these extra 10% of transactions. I think that there are some major holes in this argument though, and I really think I should point them out because there's significant weaknesses, and I'm actually surprised that this guy made them. For a start, it's true that to get NHR you need to either buy a property in Portugal or you need to rent a property in Portugal. That's not a subject of dispute. However, although there were 16,300 new NHR applicants in 2023, not all of these are households. They're not all individual households. Many of these people came as couples. Therefore, the number is not 16,300 new households that are coming into Portugal. It's significantly less than that. I would estimate that at least half of the people who came to Portugal came as a couple, and therefore they're only taking up one residence. They're not buying an individual house each. So I think that number of 16,300 needs to come down dramatically, at least to, for example, 12,000 to reflect that fact. Another point would be that of these 16,300 NHR applications in 2023, about 2,500 of them came from Portuguese who were returning to Portugal. These are people who've maybe been working in the UK or the US for a long time, and they've decided to return to their native country. And they are also eligible for NHR. It's not confined to foreigners. So I think that takes out quite a number as well. And therefore it's unreasonable to blame the whole thing on foreigners, if a substantial proportion are indeed returning Portuguese nationals. In the second instance, what this guy has done is he's basically said, okay, so there were 168,000 housing sales transactions and there were 16,300 NHR applications, so it's basically 9.8%. That's the rate. But this is completely wrong because you can either rent or buy, and we don't know how many rent and how many buy. I know people who rent, basically in urban areas, the people that I know living there, many more of them are renting. Whereas if you're looking at people who are living in rural areas, people who have NHR expats here, do tend to buy. I don't know the statistics for how many rent and how many buy, but what I do know is that not everybody buys and not everybody rents. But what this guy is assuming is that everybody bought. He's got those 92,500 rental contracts and he just completely ignored them. He's got 168,000 sales and he just divided the number of NHR applications by the number of sales whilst ignoring the rentals. If you combine the rental levels and the sales levels, it comes to a number of around 260,000 transactions. And if the number of NHR applicants, the raw number 16,300, is divided by the total of these transactions, it only comes out at 6.28% of transactions. If you then account for people with NHR actually coming here as couples and households rather than everybody individually, then it falls to a figure of around 4.7%. And beyond that, if you calculated the number of Portuguese who were actually involved in this process, returning Portuguese nationals, it would fall comfortably below 4%. So basically what we're saying is that the people who come to Portugal with NHR, they account for about 4% of property transactions, whether it's rental or buying. And that therefore they have that 4% of transactions has moved the market up so dramatically. Personally, I find that very difficult to believe, considering that the number of NHR applications in 2023 was higher than ever, and the property price increase in 2023 certainly wasn't higher than ever. In fact, the property price increase in Portugal has been on an upward trend for a very, very long time. I also think there's a kind of a misconception around NHR applicants that somehow everyone with NHR is wealthy, they've got like 10, 20 million or something like that. It is wrong. Basically all the foreigners that I know are on NHR, and the reason they're on NHR is because people told them they should get NHR. They said, you should get NHR if you're coming here. Most people get it. It just involves clicking a box in the Finances website. It's not really a very arduous process. I did it myself. Therefore, people got it whether they even need it or not. I don't think it indicates a lot, to be honest. Most of the people that I know here are older, they're pensioners, and they've been here for many, many years. They're benefiting from the NHR 0% tax on pensions under the old scheme before it changed in 2020 to 10% tax. And of the new arrivals, they're paying tax on their pension at 10%. I mean, it's not a dramatic amount of money, it's not a dramatic change. But even if these people were living in Portugal with no NHR, they wouldn't be paying that much more tax anyway. In total in Portugal, the latest statistics I've been able to find, which come from 2022, show that there are 72,500 NHR holders in the country. If we add the 16,000 from 2023, it brings us up to about 90,000. So we're saying that those 90,000 people, who are wrongly assumed to be all wealthy people, by the way, but let's even think that they are. Those 90,000 people, which represents less than 1% of the population of Portugal, Portugal has a population of around 10.5 million, have single-handedly moved the housing market. I find it a little bit difficult to believe. It may have had an effect, especially in some areas, for example, in Lisbon, Porto, Madeira, the Algarve. Yes, there may have been an effect there in constrained geographical contexts. But to me, to label this as one of the primary drivers of property price increases in Portugal, I think is absurd. I do not think that of these, 90,000 people, it represents even 90,000 households. It probably represents something more in the line of 60,000 households. So then you're in the territory of saying that basically 1% of Portuguese households or so have had this immense influence on the property market and have basically by themselves pushed up prices. I just don't accept the logic of that. It's not really conceivable that that is the principal cause. It's just something that's around the edges having a little bit of influence, but I don't think it's hugely impactful. One of the things I dislike about Portugal is that there is somewhat of a tendency to blame foreigners for things, especially rich foreigners. Portugal is a very left-wing socialist country, and blame the rich is very much a thing here. And if foreigners are perceived as rich, then they're going to get blamed for things. And to be honest, I think that's what we're seeing in this instance. People see others coming into Portugal who are maybe from other European countries or North America or something like that, and they see that these people have more money than them and they don't like it. It's just basically as simple as that. And therefore they attribute all kinds of negativity to this phenomenon of really higher end foreign immigration into Portugal, which I think is really undeserved. From my own personal experience, most of the foreigners who are living in Portugal, at least around me, are retirees. A lot of them come from the UK. It would definitely be the dominant group. There aren't very many Americans here. Although Americans dominate YouTube about Portugal, they definitely don't dominate the statistics. There are only like 14,000 Americans resident in Portugal, in contrast to 47,500 Brits, for example. People from Britain, people from Ireland, people from Northern Europe, they move to Portugal usually in their older age, over the age of 50 or more commonly over the age of 60 when they've retired, and they come here with pensions. And even if it's just a state pension in the UK or Ireland or Finland or somewhere like that, it's massively better than what the state pension is in Portugal. A British or Irish pension right now, it's something like €1,100 per month. Whereas I think the best Portuguese pension that would be available if you've worked for like 35 years or something is something in the order of €450 per month. It's not really very impressive. So at a minimum, you've got these people who are coming in with that level of income, which is better than what the locals have. And probably they have significant other financial assets. They might have sold their house in the UK and they're bringing that money over. They may have private pensions or investments or whatever. All of this is money that's going to be invested in Portugal and spent in Portugal. This is a fundamental benefit to the Portuguese economy. If they buy a house, the government gets the transfer duty tax, IMT. If they buy a house and live there, then the government collects the IMI tax every year, which is like council tax or property tax in Portugal. They buy cars, the government collects IUC. The previous Portuguese owners who actually sold the property to the foreigner, they pay capital gains tax and or income tax. If they're renting properties to foreigners, the Portuguese owners of the properties have to pay income tax on that as well for the rental contract income. Foreigners living in Portugal buy a lot of stuff. They buy cars, they decorate their homes, they employ people to do their gardens, they employ people to clean their houses in many cases. They go shopping, they just buy an immense amount of stuff, and they pay a lot of tax on that as well, and consumption tax. Plus, the positive effect of having this large group of fairly wealthy foreigners here is that it creates a whole industry of people, Portuguese people, who can speak English quite well, who thrive around them, providing all the kinds of services they need. Everything from lawyers and accountants to gardeners and handymen. All of these people who are Portuguese people are benefiting from the presence of the foreigners in the economy. And I think that that's something which is often forgotten. And if all of these people, like these NHR people, they just, decided that they're not staying in Portugal and went home, then the effect on the economy would be profoundly negative. I can absolutely guarantee that. And it would be felt not just in housing prices, but throughout the economy in things like unemployment. Another thing to consider with many expats is that they do something that I think that many Portuguese don't, which is they go out into the countryside, into villages and places that don't have a lot of people, and they choose properties which are basically derelict or in a state of disrepair, and they buy them and they renovate them really well. And this is like buying a ruin in Portugal. In my opinion, it's a terrible idea because a ruin can really ruin your life and it can consume 5 to 10 years and fill your life with woe. But there are people, mainly British people in my experience, also a lot of Dutch, who like to do this. They like to undertake these kind of projects, which basically most Portuguese people would never touch. They get involved and they rehabilitate properties in areas of low population density. And I think that that's a good thing for the country. Not only is it injecting money into the economy because they have to buy all of the decoration materials, etc., but it's helping to revive communities which have experienced depopulation. So whereas a lot of, we can say, low-end migration does go into the major urban areas, I think that a lot of the NHR type migration Yes, there are some concentrations, I will admit that, but it's much more spread out throughout the country. You know, people up and down the Silver Coast, there are people in central Portugal, there are people in the Algarve, there are people in the north of Portugal who are doing things like buying ruins and renovating them. So I really do think that it's a net positive for Portugal, and it's not even close when we're deciding whether bringing in people from richer European countries to live in Portugal and retire here is a good thing or a bad thing. It's not even really debatable. It's clearly a good thing. It's clearly beneficial. It has a minimal effect on the property market, in my opinion, and it has a lot of good effects on, for example, the tax base, the amount of revenue the government generates, and employment for Portuguese people. Moving away from the influence of NHR and talking about alojamento local. Now, this is a designation in Portugal which is given to basically short-term rental accommodation. It's the kind of thing that people would use for Airbnb, people who are staying for a night, people who are staying for a couple of days, people who are staying for a month, something like that. Now, it's classically used in big cities like Lisbon and Porto, but it's all over Portugal. You can find, wherever you go, you'll find AL. You can see the AL sign on the wall as you walk past, usually, that designates that a building is being used for this. It is something which is widespread and has witnessed phenomenal growth in Portugal. I mean, the growth in this has just been absolutely exponential. For example, between 2014 and 2018 in Lisbon, the growth rate of alojamento local, short-term rental accommodation, was 100% per year. Per year, not over the whole period, but per year. And this has led to what? It's led to several neighbourhoods in Lisbon and Porto basically being hollowed out, and the majority of the people who used to live there, maybe they were tenants, they've been priced out of the market. Their landlords have pushed them out because they want to use the building for AL. They want to use it for Airbnb short-term rentals because the returns on this are just massively higher. I think that it's much, much more valid to say that property owners in Portugal, you must remember the majority of these are Portuguese property owners. They've created the housing shortage by transitioning their properties from longer term rentals, which has reduced the number of longer term rentals on the market and therefore pushed up the price because there just isn't the availability. And they've transitioned into this short-term tourist-based business. Now, of course, tourism brings its own benefits to the economy. It creates a lot of jobs. You've got tour guides and restaurants and cafes and tourist attractions and all of these kind of things. Wonderful from those kind of perspectives, yes. But if you just look at it from the point of view of what is it doing to property prices, particularly in touristy areas, then I think it is inarguable that it has had a profoundly negative effect. And this effect is probably the biggest of all, especially in the big cities and the touristy areas. And I do feel that the protesters have a very valid point when they say that the government has reneged on its promises to do something about alojamento local. They're making it easier to get the license to do it, and their policies are going in the wrong direction. I fundamentally agree with that. Having lived in other countries like Thailand, that also witnessed this short-term rental rapid growth phenomenon, I can absolutely assure you it has a marked effect on long-term rental prices, because as you see more and more long-term rental properties disappear and become basically tourist accommodation, the prices go up. They have to go up because there's not the availability to absorb the demand anymore. And yes, it is an absolute cause of this situation, particularly for rentals. Although it does have an effect on property prices as well, because there is a relationship obviously between the rental price of the property and the valuation of that property. Lastly, and this is something that a lot of people really don't like to talk about, I think in one sense, the protesters were right to identify foreigners as having an influence on property prices in Portugal. I think that by targeting those on NHR, for example, I really think they're barking up the wrong tree. What they need to talk about is just immigration. It's the elephant in the room here, and it really needs to be discussed because it has a massive impact, particularly on prices and occupancy rates amongst, lower end accommodation. A lot of immigration into Portugal is coming from Africa and Brazil and Central Asia, these kinds of places. These people have to live somewhere. Where do they go? What kind of houses are they buying? Are they going to buy $1 million property in the Algarve? I think it's highly unlikely. They're much, much more likely to be competing with Portuguese people who have very limited incomes of maybe €1,000 a month and competing with them for cheap housing. I think it is absolutely certain that this is a major cause of the housing crisis in Portugal. Again, particularly in urban areas, because that's where most of the migrants tend to congregate. So you're now seeing IMA's latest report, which basically is talking about immigration levels into Portugal in 2023. And we can see the startling statistic that the number of foreigners living in Portugal and registered with IMA increased by 33.6% compared to 2022. So up by a third in just a year. It's startling. Looking at the regions that were most affected by this, you can see that Madeira had a 19% increase, Faro, it was around 14%, but then really moving up the scale, you can see Lisbon, 37% more foreigners living in Lisbon in 2023 than in 2022, Sintra, almost 33%, Porto, 52.8%, Braga 41.2%, Seixal 45.3%. All of these are increases year over year. They're not decreases. That is just enormous. And I think it explains a huge amount about why we're having a housing crisis in Portugal right now in 2024. If you introduce like a huge amount of people into the country, especially people who perhaps don't have a lot of money, then they're definitely going to put immense pressure on the supply of accommodation, particularly at the lower end of the scale. I think most acutely this is probably felt in Lisbon, where it's noted by IMA that 9 of the 12 municipalities with the highest number of foreign residents were in the Lisbon metropolitan area. I think that what we can say in terms of the effect of this migration on the housing situation is that if you introduce hundreds of thousands of new residents to a country like Portugal, which only has a population of 10.5 million people, if you introduce hundreds of thousands of new people every single year into the country, then yeah, it's going to cause a massive shortage of housing, especially if you're not building enough housing, which Portugal clearly isn't. And if you compound this by taking a lot of housing off the market and converting it into short-term tourist accommodation, then I think it's going to be even worse. So I mean, these are really the factors that are driving the housing crisis in Portugal. Speculation is of course a major component. I don't really agree that the NHR thing is a valid complaint. I think it only has a minor effect. Levels of mass immigration into the country are very high, and they put a lot of pressure, especially on the demand for cheaper housing, rentals and cheaper properties. I think so. And lack of new construction. Portugal just constructs far, far too few properties in comparison to most countries around the world, and also doesn't do a very good job of managing the existing housing stock. Therefore, in summary, I really do think that the people who organise these housing protests in Portugal are correct. There is a housing crisis here, but I think that they're incorrect about some of the causes. I do not believe that the NHR foreigner group has nearly as much responsibility as is attributed to it. Speculation does deserve focus. Alojamento local deserves a lot of attention, especially in urban centres and tourist areas, because I think that that is probably the major cause of the problem. And of course, addressing low-end immigration into Portugal, or total immigration into Portugal, as really the elephant in the room. I think this has a profound influence on real estate prices, and particularly rental prices at the lower end of the spectrum, particularly the exact type of accommodation that many of these protesters are complaining about, that they can't afford to rent any kind of accommodation for a reasonable price, and many of them are earning salaries which are in the 1,000 euros or less per month range. I don't think it's a bunch of rich expats coming here on NHR which have caused the problem. It's much more likely to be the huge wave of immigrants that have come, many from Portuguese speaking language countries in the last few years. You simply cannot take the number of foreigners in your country from around 480,000 in 2018 up to over 1 million in 2023, while simultaneously not building very many houses and having a mass tourism operation for AL. And not feel this kind of effect. I think that immigration is really a core cause here, along with alojamento local. I think that those two are the real twin evils that are causing this problem for many Portuguese people. Alright, well, I hope everyone found this rather long video informative. Obviously, this is a topic which I'm interested in, and particularly the theme of immigration is another topic which interests me, and maybe something that I will cover in a future video. Anyway, I hope people found this content useful, and I will see you soon in the next video.